Present. Excellent. She shouldn't be much longer.
I'm not in here.
Lily, is the stream started? Okay, cool. Thanks.
The affirming team certainly is. Yep.
All right, thank you. I'll just take about 10 more seconds to get set up. So I'll just take POIs in the chat, but I'll ask partway through my case. You don't have, so the negating team doesn't have to stress about that too much.
Could you repeat that? Sorry, could you repeat that? Sorry.
So just POIs in the chat if you want, but I'll ask periodically throughout my case, so you don't have to. There's not too much pressure to worry about that.
Sorry. I just add, make sure if you're spectating, you don't message the chat. The chat can only be used by chairs, judges, and teams.
Oh, wait, could we use the POI sign, if that's right? Or...
Yep, that's perfectly visible for me, so yeah. All right, sweet. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. On the affirming side of the house, we strongly believe that it is a principal right to have the ability to make informed consent decisions, and this is something that we feel is not being accomplished under the status quo. Now, today, we will win this debate if we can prove that our side of the house has far better outcomes for young adults living in isolated faith communities. Now, I have 2 points of substantive for today's debate. Firstly, as to how our side of the house provides much better informed consent for young adults living in these communities, and secondly, as to how our side reduces the risk of religious extremism. But I'd first just like to discuss our team's model. Now, on our side of the house, we support giving a year of freedom outside of a young adult's religious environment at the age of 18, similar to the Amish tradition of Rumspringa. So we would initiate a government agency to protect these people, and we support giving these people specific access to counselling and affordable housing, and we fully support that these people would meet with other members of other isolated faith religions to trade life stories and to feel like they belong in the wider community of the outside world. So why do we choose 18? Because that is when we believe you officially transition to an adult, where you should have the freedom, the right to choose as to how you live your life. So we see that under 18, you're technically a child when your parents are able to make this decision, but we believe that once you turn 18, once you transition, once you become this adult, you're able to effectively decide the quality of your own life without the interference of anyone else, which brings me nicely onto my first point about informed consent. So we believe that it is principally important that anyone who participates in any kind of isolated structure, religious or otherwise, should have the freedom of choice for this lifestyle. Now, there are a few reasons as to why this doesn't currently happen under the negating team status quo. Firstly, that the majority of people who live in these isolated environments were born into these communities and have not experienced the outside world. For example, we see communities like the Hasidic Jews who only get to visit other parts of their city on the yearly, so they don't really get the full experience of the outside world, or communities like the Amish who never interact with technology, e.g. cars, the internet, and other cultures in the outside world. And because these people are only viewing the world through a certain sanitized lens, they necessarily cannot make the informed decision on whether or not to participate in this outside world. Under the status quo, there is a much higher likelihood of lies and misinformation being spread by pastors and other religious leaders who simply believe that they're protecting children from these kinds of harmful outside environments. What does this effectively mean? This means that these people are removed from the right of choice as they are essentially brainwashed by these religious leaders, as they have no other experience or no other comprehension of any other way of life. This is not a mischaracterization of the moot. We believe on our side of the house, as we have just explained to you why these religious systems are effectively coercive for young adults. Now, what does this look like for the outside world, for young adults in these religious communities living in the outside world? Now, let's use the example of Rumspringa, as I explained earlier, to justify this. In this Amish community, people with no exposure to the outside world are better able to see and understand reasoning for and both against remaining within their isolated faith, because they now have access to an entire world's information at their fingertips. This gives them the right as adults to make an informed decision. And in this example, the Amish hugely value this tradition because they end up with a community of adults who see the outside world as sin and choose to remain faithfully within their isolated community. So on our side of the house, we believe that other isolated religions would follow the suit of the Amish Rumspringa tradition and give these young members access to the outside world in the hopes that they would come back at the end of the year with effectively renewed faith and dedication to their religion, which better benefits the entire community as a whole. So on our side of the house, we have informed consent by allowing these people to experience a foreign way of life to them, which we are very proud to support. Now onto my next point, but before I do that, I'd like to take a point of interest if you have one.
When you grow up in a community full of 18 years, how do you override 18 years of education within 1 year? And why do you think that elders will not be incentivized to demonize the outside?
Yeah, so I will explain my second point, why elders won't be expected to demonize the outside world, so thank you for that. But we also see, as I explained earlier, that these are adults, these are 18-year-olds, and as I explained earlier, they should be allowed to make informed decisions, and furthermore, their brains are developed enough that they have the ability to see both sides of the argument and see which side they would rather choose moving forwards in their life. Now to my second point, which is about reducing extremism. So under the status quo, the reason that a lot of these religious communities are isolated in the first place is largely because they want their practices and systems to remain unchanged by the outside world. On our side of the house, we see this as generally a bad thing because it typically means customs from, say, the Bible era remain unchanged. This could look like forced marriages and potentially advanced forms of racial prejudice and other systemic abuse within these communities. These issues aren't generally addressed due to the community's isolation, as I described earlier, and not knowing any other way of living life. So what does this look like? This means that 18-year-olds leave the community, they learn the abnormality of abuse, they learn the abnormality of abuse, often by powerful people, often men, by understanding and relating to our own way of life. Again, this might look like women knowing it's actually normal for them to be able to choose who they marry. And we need to see that on their side of the house, there are documented cases of forced marriage and sexual assault within these communities, and that regardless of whether these 18-year-olds return to these communities or not, we see the beneficial outcomes either way on our side of the house. We see that these returned 19-year-olds will have the ability to compare their life both in the status quo and in the outside world, which is something that is not necessarily achievable under the NEGS model. We also see that when you get people coming back to these communities with experience of the outside life, they're more likely to stand up for themselves, as I described earlier, if they see these cases of sexual assault or racial prejudice, if they see things being done by these religions that they now understand is wrong. And furthermore, on that point, it might also look like these religious leaders that I've described earlier taking a more prolonged interest in the returned 19-year-olds and valuing them for their ideas that they are bringing back from the outside world, seeking to learn from them about what the outside world is like because they don't often get to see this for themselves. This could mean implementing policies that better comply with both their faith and the liberal side of the outside world. So our side of the house believes that both these mechanisms lead to less abuse of power and closer practices to those of our own world, while still maintaining religious beliefs within these isolated communities. This reduces extremism as we see the world's isolated faiths more closely reflect our own, while advancing practices and ways of life in these communities and keeping potentially manipulative religious leaders in check. More than that, on our side, we see young members of these faiths far less likely to radicalize against the government on our side of the world, as they have a thorough understanding of ideas from both ways of living life. So under our model, we see far better outcomes for 18-year-olds in isolated religious communities, and this is why we have won today's debate. On our side of the house, we provide a better quality of life for both young adults and other members of closer faiths living in these communities, and I challenge the negating side to bring a case that better benefits all parties. We stand for the right to informed consent for everyone and to mitigate the risk of religious extremism. Very, very proud to affirm. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up Jess to open the negating team's case.
Am I audible? Cool. When Av stood up here today and said it was a principal right to make informed, consentful decisions, they lost the debate because being required to go into the outside world is not consentful, nor is it informed due to the lack of information from your isolationist community. What is our path to victory in today's debate? We need to help the individuals, specifically the stakeholders, the 18-year-olds in the community, or we need to preserve the religious integrity of the isolated community. Secondly, onto some framing. So why is religion beneficial? It is integral to an individual's personality. It underpins their ideology and the ways that they interact with society. Furthermore, it grounds people as it allows them to believe that they exist not only in their current life, but in the afterlife as well. It gives them a sense of permanence. It doesn't mean they think that their presence is menial. But secondly, what does isolationist religions and communities looks like? It looks like a very purist community. You've got a set conception of what your religion is because it's been ingrained into you for the last 18 years. And because of how they've been brought up, they most likely believe that their sect of religion is the most connected with God, and they're unlikely to want to engage with other forms of religion. They're probably averse to external influences in the forms of outside communities because of what we've just explained. Moving on to some rebuttal. We got told in their model that these isolationist community 18-year-olds are going to get counselling and they're going to be able to support trading stories with like other isolated communities. Firstly, we tell you that they may not feel comfortable talking to a complete stranger who has no emotional ties to them. They're not someone they've grown up with, especially when they've grown up in such a tight-knit community. You're used to having people that know you, that know your struggles. But secondly, we're not only talking to other isolationist communities, all of the benefits they try to bring to you about extremism fall out of the debate because they're continuing to perpetuate the same ideas that are circling within those isolationist religions. Next, we tell you that they spoke about that you're born into the community and therefore you don't get an opportunity to interact with the outside world. We tell you that when you force them to do this, it's the outside world that they're probably religiously opposed to. They're forced into engaging with these structures, which is therefore a forced decision, not a rational one, that they've been able to make by their own metrics. But we also tell you that when they spoke about exposure to the outside world and they can see the information for and against faith, it's probably very confusing because the outside world is very contrasted to the world that you've been brought up when you're still quite young at 18, your brain doesn't finish developing till 25. But lastly, we tell you when they tell us about learning about abnormalities of abuse and wanting to know that you don't have to marry, we tell you the community is still allowing these harms. Those harms are therefore symmetrical on their side of the house, but because of the psychological trauma that exists, because of those harms they brought, they don't actually get any benefits for these people anyway. Moving on to our first point, which is how this policy harms individuals within the community.
What are we trying to prove? We're trying to prove that firstly, being thrown into the outside world with no preparation as to what to expect is harmful to the 18-year-old. But secondly, family relations can be fragmented by this policy. So how do we prove this? Firstly, what sort of preparation will religious communities undergo in light of this? There are two parts to this point. Firstly, due to isolationist behaviour previously, the elders probably have very little knowledge of the outside world, and if they do have knowledge, it's most likely to be a skewed perception that they will impart onto their children. What does this mean? Firstly, it means that this information has been passed down, which reinforces and repeats the narrative that outside communities are harmful. But secondly, the parents want to, at the end of the day, protect their children. That's most likely why they became isolationists, because they believe it is what is best. They will instill a fear of the outside world into their children to ensure caution. This looks like elders potentially warning children of traffickers of the outside world, violence on the streets, and they're like scaring their children and fear-mongering. But secondly, the elders and parents have an incentive to instill caution and distaste for the outside world so that child will come back after their year of living outside the society, which links into our second point. The second mechanism is that when you're requiring 18-year-olds to go out, it's going to be overwhelming and most likely a negative experience. Why is this? So we've proven to you that outside knowledge is minute, and therefore it's going to be a huge culture shock to these 18-year-olds. The way people dress, speak, and interact is different in the outside of society. For example, Hasidic Jews who's used to an orthodox way of living, where women over the age of 12 wear clothing that covers their shoulders and knees. They don't touch men. They're respectful to their elders. They're thrust into an environment where the norms are the exact opposite. So what does this mean? It means that they don't know how to interact with these new people as their ideals are so differently. Secondly, they can't successfully participate in like social activities. For example, going out to dinner because they've got dietary requirements because they need to eat a certain way. But lastly, they feel like they stand out and people attracts your tribe, right? You want to stick with the people that are like you. The other mechanism we've got in this is because of the way you dress, your affiliation with your religion is most likely to be extremely obvious. So like, for example, Hasidic Jews, males will wear a kippah, everyone got sits on their clothing, it sets them apart from the rest of society. This means that these vulnerable groups are more vulnerable to attacks from external groups as their religion is identified. Because they've been part of an isolationist community where anti-Semitism is unlikely to exist, they're unsure how to react when they're put in the compromising situations. Therefore, this leads to two things. Firstly, they fight back and they perpetuate the negative stereotypes associated with their culture, or secondly, they do nothing and they show the perpetrator that they're susceptible to bullying, and this carries on as an never-ending cycle. But what else do we tell you? We tell you that 18-year-olds are most likely to lose support networks that they were accustomed to. The collectivist work vibes, for example, of like the Mennonite communities, doesn't translate to an external community where you need to get a job, but firstly, you like understanding of how employment structures work, which means you're unlikely to get the information or job opportunities if you're hesitant to engage with things like technology, as we heard that Mennonites don't. But secondly, you lack qualifications from the mainstream education, or like you don't have a social security number or ID, which is what employers look for. Thirdly, we tell you there's structural discrimination against minority groups that are different because these people cannot recognize things like being paid low wages, similar to undocumented Latino immigrants being paid below minimum wage. This is particularly harmful to women raised in these traditional roles that now must have to become the self-serving breadwinners fighting against a glass ceiling that they don't know about. More on this point, we tell you that reintegration is rocky. You probably want to reintegrate into your society due to that negative exposure. But firstly, now that you've been exposed to all of these external values and systems and ideas that conflict with and your connection to these religions, it leads to an identity crisis for these people. But secondly, it's hard to maintain a connection with your original isolationist community when you don't have things like cellular contact and you've got a year of your life without them. They evolve and you evolve. Thirdly, the community leaders are hesitant to allow these people back into communities because A, they're seen as traitors, B, they're afraid of liberal ideas which will divide the community, but C, even if they aren't because they want to survive, this makes the tall, difficult task when you have these disconnected people coming back. Lastly, we tell you that parents feel a loss when they lose their child for a year. There's no mechanisms to stay in touch with their child. The Mennonites don't use technology. There's no community pathways available. But secondly, you've probably got conservative family structures. Your family spends a lot of quality time together. You pray together, you eat together, you work together. When one person leaves, it throws off the family dynamic. It leaves a hole in the family. What this means is that the experience is highly unenjoyable for the majority of the community. We would far rather no policy than a policy that is actively harmful to these people mentally and physically when they're destabilized and ripped away from the community. They lose their sense of purpose. Their religion is undermined by others around them. They lose their identity. Moving on to our second point, which is why it's good, which is why not having the policy is good for the integrity of communities. What are we proving? That not implementing this policy will protect the community as a whole by maintaining them rather than destabilizing or destroying the community. How do we prove this? Let's examine the two ways that communities might react to the policy. Firstly, extremely unlikely, as isolated communities probably don't like the outside influence, but like let's just say they react well, right? For example, they cooperate with enforcing this policy. How might this harm the community? Firstly, if kids start leaving more, the community dies out as people are less involved with this community, which means that more people are likely to leave than join because of the isolationist religious communities probably do have strict rules. They're less connected with people, and like sometimes people prefer social freedoms and things like that. But secondly, it impedes on their integrity as an isolationist community, as they have less purity and ideals of the outside influence. It causes tension in spiritual ideas. This is why the policy is extremely harmful, and I'm proud to oppose.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up Will to continue the affirming team's case.
Can everyone hear me? Yep, excellent. I'm just laying out my paper. I've got a lot to work with, so. All right. Look, panel, let's have a look at what's actually at stake in this debate, right? Because what the negating team fails to address is that in the real world, we have already shown you that there is like documented cases of abuse in these communities, right? We are the only team, the only part of this house that can actually stand to correct these abuses or in some way mitigate them and free people from the constraints of a society or of powerful elders that actually are likely to abuse them, right? Look, if you're a young person in the communities who like actually wants to leave, which we believe is like likely on both sides of the house, whether you believe this extreme characterization that they put out or not, like we believe that you get better treatment and more opportunities on our side of the house. That's kind of the key thrust of the split that I'm going to be delivering you today, but I'm also going to be doing two kind of key points of clash around how we can A, get better informed consent for these communities, but B, reduce extremism within these communities. All right, look. Panel, it's pretty clear that this is like probably the most important case, consent, in today's debate, right? Probably the most important point in today's case, right? Because at the point where NEG is actually tolerating hundreds of thousands of people living in their adult lives without the ability to make a realistic, informed decision about the way that they live, then like we actually see that they're tolerating like a unjust system where they're not being given their human rights as an adult, right? There are a few points on this, right? Firstly, they tell us that actually it violates the consent and ability of the entire religion to actually like have control over their people. Right. Firstly, we think there are a couple of reasons why religious communities are likely to respond well to this, aside from what Noah already gave you. Number one, they get like a guarantee that their adult participants have a strong commitment to their religious principles. This is super valuable because they're like actually they like in the way that the Amish are treated, like they're actually going to be having people who are like genuinely committed to the way that they work. Secondly, like we see that they actually lose the people who are likely to take advantage of their system and abuse people, right? Because these people are likely to do better in the real world, where they can become things like scammers, like gamblers and things like that, because those are the people who are actually sinners and these communities are actually trying to get rid of, right? But on that, even if some communities don't participate willingly, we think that we still get a massive benefit on our side of the house, right? Because these are the communities that need this the most, right? Because these are the ones that are likely to be the most coercive, the most abusive, and the ones that are most likely to be harmful to the people living within them. What we tell you fundamentally, the principle in this debate is that the consent of a young person and the ability to make a decision about how they're going to live the rest of their life matters more than the consent of an elder to govern their people and to like have control over those people, right? Okay. On this, then they tell us that like young people aren't just likely to willingly participate and actually want to go out there. Firstly, we tell you that like first, young people just have an inherent curiosity about the world that we think is like likely to be consistent across cultures. But secondly, like people in these communities are likely to like have had older sisters by the time that this model is implemented who like have actually gone out and experienced this experience. They want to have that too, right? They want to actually see what their sisters have seen and what their siblings have seen and why they can actually go and come back into the communities. But secondly, like young people who are more committed to the faith and are more likely to come back at the end are likely to see this as a strong test of their faith, right? Which means that they're actually likely to get a spiritual benefit out of this as well, meaning they can get a strong connection to their religion. Okay, they tell us that we can't override like 18 years of programming, whatever that that means, right? We tell you that, first of all, we don't need to override and completely replace their worldview. We just need to remind them that there is another option that they can live on. Secondly, though, we tell them that the sheer amount of information that's available within an entire year in the outside world is more than enough to help them form like counter perspectives. But thirdly, we tell you that contrast is extremely powerful, right? Because they tell us that there's going to be like significant programming on our side of the house. We tell you that we reduce that because if there's a contrast between what they're told and what they see, they actually note that very heavily, right? Okay. Finally, on that, then they say that like people can't just participate properly in the real world because they're likely to like not be able to have like a social security number or driver's license. First of all, like in Noah's model, obviously he provides mechanisms to how we can protect people's material conditions and their mental health. So that's something that we've already kind of dealt with. But secondly, we see that like actually, even if this doesn't exist, like the liberal world is like super open to these new perspectives and likely wants to learn from people who have had these other perspectives, right? We see that there's like an actual fascination with people who come from estranged environments. That's why we get shows, right, like the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt and stuff, where we get people who are like actually in these environments, right? But thirdly, right, even if like this doesn't exist yet, people are generally able to integrate on some basis, right? Like we get people who are like in some way able to find a job, able to get some sort of employment because they have the same labor power that everyone else has, right? Okay, I'll take a point and then I'll move on to the point about how we reduce extremism better.
How do you plan on implementing enforcement mechanisms when communities do not cooperate? Will it be by force? How are you going to do it?
Look, we think that these communities actually do exist to some extent at the grace of the government, right? Like the government like allows these communities to not pay tax. They allow them to like do things like avoid sort of systemic investigations. And we think that the government is actually able to enforce those if they don't cooperate. But we actually think that communities are likely to cooperate because of the extent of like religious comparison within their systems. They're likely to actually just want to cooperate rather than actually have to face things like the IRS, right? Okay, on reducing extremism then. Like, Neg would have you believe that our team looks into trying to destroy religion entirely. We deny this completely, right? Our singular goal in this point is to ensure that we are actually able to confront and halt abuses of power within these closed-off environments. First of all, they tell you that people are going to be more radicalized in government because of our model. Right, I already explained earlier why sects are likely to be more open to this, but here's like some additional responses, right? Firstly, we believe that like far-right powerful men are like actually likely to treat children better and like less likely to abuse them on our side of the house because they know that their children are likely to get some kind of better treatment when they turn 18 on the outside world, and therefore they want to give them a good comparative to work with, right? So we believe that we actually get better treatment of children on our side. Secondly, they said that elders are likely to demonize the outside, right? This is completely like comparatively worse on their side because elders can say whatever they want without any kind of fear of comparison, right? If they're able to tell you that like people from the outside world are like blood-sucking demons, right? Then they're actually like able to like not see any kind of comparison to that in the real world. Whereas if they tell you that for 18 years of your life and then you go out in the 18 years of your life and you meet some really nice gay and lesbian people, then you're like, oh my goodness, like these are actually like really good people that we can get along with. That's a comparative that we think we get better results for on our side of the house. Finally, though, on how we halt like further abuses, right? Okay. First of all, we tell you like the government has like the insight now from like people who leave the community at 18 can actually report their experience and thus enforce it. But secondly, like we tell you that like when mixing with other faiths, like these different extremist ideas are able to contribute and like outweigh each other, but also that like we create a dialogue and allow these people to bond and share solidarity over their like differences within the outside world. Lastly, they tell you that people will like experience anti-Semitic abuse or whatever when they reach the outside world. We tell you like, first of all, people probably like need to know that that kind of abuse and like hatred exists in the outside world if they're to make an informed decision about that type of thing. But secondly, we tell you that like having these kind of government bureaus in place for protecting these people means that they're likely to get therapy for this type of thing. They're likely to get a bit more. Just finally on my split about how we ensure like that people leave under better circumstances, right? What does opt-out look like on their side? What does people trying to leave these communities look like on their side of the house? What we see is that people flee communities like Gloriavale at random times during their life due to abuses of power that we actually halt on our side of the house. This looks like children fleeing Gloriavale with just the clothes on their back and not actually being able to get any kind of support whatsoever. Whereas on our side of the house, we offer that when they turn 18, we offer them the opt-out. How do we reduce this? First of all, we lessen the abuses of power in the first place, like we've already proved in our first and second speeches. But secondly, like children just don't flee unprepared because they know that a better life is awaiting them if they choose it at 18, right? This means that we don't violate the sovereignty of parents over their children before they're 18, but also that we don't actually like get these people who are fleeing under uncertain conditions and are likely to end up in a far worse situation than they were within their religious community. Look, we did this debate for Isabella Abel. We're so proud of her and we're so, so proud to affirm.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite Levi to continue the negating team's case.
Okay, am I audible? Side affirming loses today's debate when it takes them till second to give us an enforcement mechanism for how they are going to get those manipulative religious leaders that they generalize and characterize to actually engage with this policy, to actually start to release people, even though there apparently is this looming threat of abuse on their side of the house that harms those leaders and that harms that integrity. And when we finally get a mechanism, it is that they will make them pay taxes. Note that the reason that these groups are currently not made to pay taxes is because the government has no effective enforcement mechanism to make them pay taxes. How are you supposed to track things like IRS records for a group that doesn't engage with the wider economy? How are you supposed to enforce that when you don't pay it outside of maybe like excessive violence, which does actually amount to force as we presented you? And how does that force avoid harming those groups that you were trying to help, such as those who are abused, such as in the case of David's Children in America, a cult that was subject to an FBI raid due to false claims of abuse that ultimately led to those children they were trying to save dying miserably in a fire. That is why side affirming loses today's debate. That is why they cannot stand on the outcomes they propose. 3 things I'll be doing in my speech then. Firstly, I'll be covering the outcomes for young adults. Secondly, on bettering these communities. And thirdly, I'll be splitting on why it's good to support and maintain independent religious communities. Firstly, then, on the outcomes for young adults. What we get here from side affirming is a lot of material on informed consent, and that this comes when you turn 18, that you suddenly should be allowed to go out into the wider world. Note that it's quite assertive and quite contradictory to say that reaching the age of 18, when you have spent the first 18 years of your life sheltered from the outside world, to suddenly be capable of running off into a wider community that you don't understand things like anti-Semitism and those types of structural issues, nor are you able to say get a job because you don't have mainstream education, because you don't have a social security number, because you don't have those things that employers look for when they try to defend you. At best, what you get is, as Jess has already told you, is things like undocumented immigrants into the US being paid below minimum wage because there's none of these protections for these people. That is what these people are subject to, right? What we instead hear as the grand solution to this from side affirming is that they would provide government support structures for these people leaving. We have 4 key responses to this. Firstly, we think that there's that religious sects generally have an innate mistrust of these types of systems, right? Because if you grow up in a community that tells you to hate the outside world and the government, and that is only worsened when they want these people to stay, right? Because they're trying to survive, then that doesn't mean that you want to engage with that type of government structure. That doesn't mean you are going to engage with it no matter how good it is. Secondly, we think there's a lack of capacity for people with a different structural background to make effective support structures, right? Because the reality is that they don't know about what these people have been through. They don't understand the structures that exist within these communities, and they don't actually have a way of then supporting them when there is this massive discrepancy between government and these young people, right? Thirdly, we think it's difficult to access records of these people leaving due to them being like off the public record. To process every single person that is able to leave a religious community is quite a difficult and hard task when there's no record of these people existing in the first place. Fourthly, it's unlikely to get public backing for these types of support structures anyway, because the average working taxpayer would rather they themselves get benefits than another dependent population that they see as other, that they have no reason to feel sympathy with because they cannot relate to them. And that's ultimately meaning that you're not even getting these support structures in all likelihood anyway. Next, we also say that these people like have a choice to take this, and that's like basically allowing these people to leave is allowing them to be happy and be free from those harmful conservative structures. Look, it doesn't like, we don't think that this is necessarily like a fair characterization, because it's actually like quite harmful and mind-boggling to sort of grow up in a community that tells you for 18 years that this is harmful, and then suddenly be like, okay, we want you to leave, we want you to go do other things in the wider world because apparently that's now good. It doesn't really make sense for how that's going to work in the mind of someone, nor that how that is going to lead to them being able to produce an informed consent. We think that things like guilt tripping and refusing to accept someone who chooses to abandon a sacred way of life makes it very hard as well for these people to reintegrate. So even if you have that willingness to leave for a year, if you do want to come back, as Side Affirming tells us, then that's very difficult because the community, one, probably doesn't want liberal ideas getting in if it is so harmful to their identity, to those leaders, if those ideas do make it in. Secondly, because they don't want to allow people who've abandoned a sacred way of life to do this. And thirdly, because when you spend a year without any contact with your family and friends, and the only people you've ever known, it's hard to maintain any sort of strong link and understanding to that religious background. What we then hear as sort of a response to this is about how this is a test of faith for people. Note that even if it's still problematic for them to reintegrate for those reasons. So this doesn't really work. And then the other element of this then is we get that these people are able to have those issues they face, apparently like abuse, like these types of things, subject to media attention. Look, note that this only feeds into the material Jess gives you at first on why it's so overwhelming to go out into the real world, because you're treating them as spectacles, you're objectifying their experience, and you're not actually understanding it. We also think that sensationalist media around these types of cases of abuses leads to these inaccurate portrayals, leads to information not actually getting through to the right way, leads to this misrepresentation of religious communities, and that is so harmful to them and to the people that they are trying to help. Lastly, we get this idea on the comparative mentality being fostered on their side, that it's unlike that you're going to suddenly like gay and lesbian people if you go and have this positive experience. Look, it's unlikely you'll go and interact with gay and lesbian people if that value system to dislike them is so ingrained in you after 18 years. And also, like, there's no reason why this is an act of harm when it is isolated to these communities. They don't really give any reason for that. That is why they lose this point. And ultimately, why they fall down on this idea, they don't engage with any of our material on why it's so hard to go out and get a job for, say, a woman who's been raised to have these traditional skills and to be supported by her family, to be supported by a community, to suddenly go out and suddenly just have to go and get a job and these types of issues. No way on how they fix this. I'll take a POI. No? Okay. Secondly, then, on bettering these communities. Look, what we hear is two key pushes from Side Affirming. The first is that they reduce extremism, and the second is that they resolve those issues of abuse. Firstly, then on extremism. Look, if that bias exists, why would these communities be willing to send, say, women off into the wider world if they're extremely hateful to women? There's no reason why that is likely to happen for those communities. Secondly, a woman sent off to external communities is never going to have these skills equipped to survive, especially because you go from being supported to not being able to, say, break the glass ceiling that you don't understand. Thirdly, on things like homophobic attitudes, these are probably made worse when you throw them onto the front line of an otherwise progressive society. And secondly, these are made worse when these communities become bitter at the government, when they alienate themselves more into these echo chambers of extremism, because they don't want to engage with a government that tells them that their way of life is incorrect. That is what Side Affirming does. That is why they actually worsen extremism, right? The second part there is reducing issues of abuse. Look, it is actually a very harmful generalization due to sensationalist media creating like this stigma towards those religious communities, right? It looks like people saying everything is a cult and everything is abusing children, when in reality, they actually provide very healthy support structures in collectivist societies, those people are able to function this. And secondly, if this exists, community leaders are going to be even more hesitant to adhere to this policy and allow people to go out. And once again, due to this issue, you need an enforcement mechanism that isn't the very thing that doesn't take place because it is so proud to oppose.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up Stella to conclude affirmative substantive.
All right, thanks guys. Just take about a minute to set up, I think. Thanks for your patience.
All right, guys, sorry, I'll just do about 10 more seconds and then I'll get myself going. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The only way the negating side can win in this debate now is proving that our model will never happen, because we have proven that informed consent is the most important part of our model, because we are looking at the benefits to young people, specifically young people who are possibly feel trapped in these environments, cannot get out. And this may not be the majority, but they are the people that we need to focus on, because they are the people who are getting harmed in the status quo. So moving into my first point of rebuttal, right? This is like the questions of, will it be forceful? Will it be coercive? And what is the current status quo? Can we make it better? So what they've tried to tell us here is that, first of all, people leaving their communities will get no preparation for the outside world, that because they're so isolated, they get little knowledge, right? And that parents will want to protect these people. And so we'll give like a really negative perspective and connotation of the outside world. The first thing we tell you here is that actually this is completely untrue. People with children leaving to the outside world will want to protect them in this new world. So they will give advice because they don't want them to go out there, really struggle, possibly die, have really, really harmful long-term effects. So we cannot see why they pose it as a negative connotation when they know that their children are going out into this environment. The second thing we tell you here around the difficulty of the transition, right? Well, we tell you that actually what we do is that cover this. And so they have not rebutted this. They've told us that under the current system, we can't do this. We told you at first that we would introduce new policies and new ways for this to happen. We see support systems being people not only of their own community, but of similar communities, and being able to interact with the outside world, which they cannot do in the status quo. And therefore they cannot win this point. The second thing we see is that even if they may not be fully prepared, they will be so much more prepared than if they need or want to leave these communities in the status quo, right? We see people currently have no positive connotation of the outside world. They have no knowledge whatsoever, and they have no way to know what it will be like, but they still need to leave because of possible abuses that are going on, which do not reflect the religious beliefs in these communities, right? So we see that actually, even in our worst case, people who need to leave are better off. The second thing we tell you is about these other religious groups socializing, right? They try to tell us that there would just be no change, like it just wouldn't happen. We tell you that, first of all, they would be less judgmental towards these other cultures, okay? Because when you interact with people who are similar but have different beliefs, your core beliefs can be the same. You can actually talk about these, but compare differences, right? And when it's in an environment where you are not being pressured by superiors, where your family is not constantly on your back telling you how to feel, you actually have the ability to think about this in your own mind and go, oh, maybe these people aren't so bad. And so we see that after you, maybe they would start to talk with and communicate with people outside of their comfort zone, right? This is something we will never ever see in the status quo when people are not able to leave. What this allows in total, right, is just a better comparison, which means that people upon return as well, right? Because this is something they have tried to talk about, which I will talk about soon. People on return will be able to discuss actually with themselves and with others, do I actually miss these people? Do I want to go back? And often, in most cases, as we've seen with the Amish example, they do go back and they have a restored faith and a restored knowledge that what they are doing is the right thing for them. All right, so moving into my next point here, they try to tell us that because of their religious ways, right? They try to tell us that because they eat differently and wear different clothes, they would feel like a huge outsider. We tell you First of all, when we implement our policy, we have thousands of people returning to these cities. They would not feel like an outsider, and society would see more of these people in the world. The second thing we tell you is that people already have to eat differently and dress differently, right? For their own beliefs that aren't necessarily religious, right? We see increased amounts of vegans. We see people with dairy allergies. And this is very similar to not wanting to eat pork or these sort of things for religious reasons, right? So we cannot see this standing in the current debate. The second thing we tell you here is that style is also evolving, right? We see different types of style coming out, and we see more people feeling more comfortable to wear what their religion suggests. And that is why we see that on our side of the house, we will have even more progress when we are introducing thousands of people into these communities that actually bring diversity. What we see in the current system is that even if we were to believe, right, that there are none of these people that eat or dress differently, we see no ability for this to progress. On our side of the house, we allow for further progress. We allow for a society that is not in a, this is what you have to look like, this is what you have to eat mentality. And that is why we will win on this point, and that they cannot prove that this does not exist. All right, moving into my next point on this here, about why people would actually want to leave, right? Or why they would be okay leaving for just 1 year. So first of all, the first thing I'd like to know is that in this debate, we have specified the stakeholders as being these young people, right, who often after 18 years have a very limited worldview in the current system, and that some of these people will leave anyway, right? We see people at 16 running away from places like Gloriavale because they just feel it is so oppressive. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you here about, right, is that often how people perceive their communities are not always positive, okay? I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but basically just setting the scene here, okay? Not everyone sees their religious communities as positive, and while most do, not all do. So then we tell you what will happen for these people that do actually really like their communities and they love living there, right? We tell you that first they will see it as a test of faith. We see it that for people who love their communities and they love their families, that they will actually want to return there. And upon return, their communities will be like, woo, you've returned, we love you. You clearly trust us, you know, you're in our faith, and we fully support you when they reintroduce to their things. The second thing is that we tell you it is so much more important to focus on the people and the opportunity it gives those who may not actually enjoy their communities, who may want a safe way to leave, right? Because we allow them with an opportunity when they turn 18 to actually leave. They will no longer have any influence, and we have support systems in place now. We also tell you that a second part of this is people who possibly weren't aware that they were being brainwashed, that weren't aware that they didn't want to live in these communities. And when they get to go outside and compare and go, oh, this is a car, that looks really cool. Or these sort of people are out here, that's really cool, right? And regardless of whether they return to their communities or not, this just creates a positive benefit for everyone involved. And that is why we will win this point. All right, the second thing here is just about the leaders and why people in power would also want to do the system. Will's already touched on this, so just to recap, we told you that they don't actually want to face things like the RIS, like huge government institutions that can go and enforce these things, no matter what way that is, right? So this actually won't be happening because the people in power won't want to see this in their communities. They want to be perceived positively by the outside world, and they want to remain with their sovereignty, with their own control. And so they will not simply not do it because they know of the consequences now. All right, just moving to the second point of clash here, which first of all, we don't see as more important. We see the most important people being the young people and being the ability that they now have to give informed consent to stay in these communities. But this point here is just about like extremism, okay? And how this will be effective. But first I'll just take a POI. No? Okay, moving on then. So first of all,
how do you suppose a government is able to make contact with these young people and explain these ideas to make them allowed to be able to have like an informed and coherent consent when the elders in their community don't because they've been isolated?
Well, first of all, you're out of time, but secondly, I'll just answer that anyway. What we see is that elders would be encouraged to give them this, and this is actually what I'm about to go into, so thank you very much for that. The first thing here that they've tried to tell us is that it will be unable to change 18 years of teaching, and that people will not be taught this. First of all, we see that changing these people is not our goal. We simply want them to be able to compare and give a choice on whether that is what they actually want in life. We are not trying to change religions. We're not trying to dismantle these religions. What we stand for is informed consent to be in these religious communities, and that young people will know what is going on. And then we see through the generations, these young people will be able to educate the next generation. And that is how we see progress within these communities while still remaining true to their own religious values. And that is why we will win this point, because we protect the young people, we give them informed consent, and we still allow them to stay true to themselves. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up Janet to close out her team substantive.
I did check that. I am audible now. I'll take POIs in chat, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For AF to win the debate today, they had to necessarily prove why they were protecting these children when they are thrusting them out after 18 years in the same environment into an unknown, fearful environment that has been exacerbated by the fear, like the demonization of their elders, and why that they will be protecting them under their side. When they lose this and fail to engage with our points, they lose the debate today. 3 things. Firstly, how do 18-year-olds engage with the outside world? Secondly, how do we improve communities? And thirdly, why informed consent doesn't actually matter and washes out of the debate. Firstly then, how do 18-year-olds engage with the outside world? They largely try to rebut our claims by saying that they're going to have an improved experience with material benefits and counseling opinions, counseling, right? They said that this is going to resolve the harms of going into the outside world with a support system that they never properly mechanized aside from government housing and counseling. We're going to flip this, right? Firstly, note that Levi gave you 4 responses at second, which their third completely ignored in terms of why this was not going to be enough. Note that distrust means that communities will be incentivized to not engage with these systems. I'll extend on this by telling you that communities are incentivized to actively make their children distrust these systems to make sure that they come back. The claim that they were going to protect them is not enough to outweigh the fact that they probably think that the best way to protect them is to bring them back into the community outside from the outside world. That means then that they are probably incentivized to demonize it and make it bad to make sure that they can come back to mommy, so then they can protect them and make them feel better, right? Secondly, the discrepancy between Levi also gave you a response of discrepancy between whether it actually helps, right? Thirdly, we tell you that also you just cannot access people. It's hard to provide support. When Levi told you how hard it is to track, that just shows how extra hard it is to actually bring their material benefits and support systems to support these kids, right? Fourthly, the lack of public buy-in also disincentivizes the government to actually provide that many extra material benefits. At the end of this then, they still have the structural problems brought to you at in terms of why you cannot get jobs, why you cannot engage, why you have different ideologies and the clashes that still happen, but I'll just extend on it more in their next claim, right? So note there, then that this support system is dysfunctional. Next then, what actually happens without the support system? They claim that you're going to engage well as outside influence, and the key claim was that you're going to have an understanding of the outside world. They the extension of that is that they're going to see people of different sexuality and somehow it's going to be good. 4 responses. Firstly, they didn't mechanize why this was going to be good. They gave you an assertion of somehow people are just going to go outside and then somehow be happy. Note that this is in contention with their secondary claim that they think that their own society is going to be better. If you have 18 years of education in terms of why your religion is better than everyone else in the outside world, which is why you're insulated, why is it that they're going to see this understanding of the outside and somehow think it's good, right? Second part of this is that they also claim that this was going to be a test of faith. We're going to flip that by telling you that that will make them even more staunch in belief. At the end of that tension that exists in their case rebuts the fact that they will actually get a good understanding of their outside. That then means that they're going to get a horrible, horrible experience when they have to override and flip their world of 18 years upside down, right? Next then, I'm going to move on to their extremism claim. We're going to flip this through 3 ways. A, they claim that racial prejudice exists. Note that this only happens when this only manifests when they interact with the outside world. When you're in your community, you're not going to exercise racial prejudice because where is the people for you to be racist against? It's only in the outside world where they will have this antagonistic interaction. B, Levi's response also extends on this. I'm just extending on Levi's response of being unlikely to interact, right? Also note that the people of different sexualities also means that people are probably these 18-year-olds are probably unlikely to interact with the people of different sexualities in the first place. So they're also not going to gather understanding that that way. C, their prejudice, the prejudice against them, they fail to engage with this. Their claim of counselling doesn't work because it's retrospective. You cannot tape up a deep bandage when you've been sworn against, when you've been yelled at with slurs, thrown at violently, and then you just go to a complete stranger who somehow is going to resolve that emotional tension and mental trauma. Doesn't make sense. Look at the harms that they accrue on their side of the house that cannot be taped up with a simple claim of counseling. What that then means is that we flip the extremism claim where the 18-year-olds will be more extreme under their side, where they go out and engage with the society that they think is hostile. That will mean that they will be more harsh, they will be more political extremists, they will be bad, and also it's not even their fault, because they're the side that pushes this policy that forces them into that hole in the first place. It's not their fault, it's this policy's fault. Thirdly then, on spiritual tensions, this means that they will also necessarily not gain outside benefits, right? Because you're not going to engage with the outside influence if it's in contention and giving you an identity crisis. Just very clearly characterize to you why that was a problem, because it is such a suffering, it destabilizes your core identity, which is extremely, extremely harmful. Fourthly then, their claim of the outside comfort zone, people just want to go outside, is in contention with their own case, where somehow people are going to come back. You either go outside and you just leave because you think the outside is better, or you don't engage with the outside at all, and it's harmful when it comes back. Also, they claim that the world is changing and somehow is going to rebut all the harms of anti-Semitism does not change, because it still exists. There's still lots of anti-Semitism. Think about all the riots, think about all the slurs that are being thrown online, think about Trumpism and all of those things. Even if style is evolving, it still doesn't stop people from alienating anything they see differently, which is what these people have done, which is what Jess has told you, right? How that makes sense. So at the end of this, their engagement is only going to be bad, and I've clearly impacted to you why there are so many mental harms. But next then, on people who leave, why they claim that people are somehow going to leave and somehow that's better, I'll take a POI. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No? Okay. Okay, next on people who leave. They claim that Gloria example is going to be somehow. Firstly, they claim that there's going to be no support system. Doesn't actually make sense, because there are support systems. This is why Fleur Beale wrote a book, and I Am Not Esther, and showed the harms of that. That is a support system that exists. Secondly, on spirituality, you cannot get over the harms of those who have left. The people who leave by their own volition have minimized the spiritual harms. Those harms still exist when you're forced outside without consent, right? Next then, on coming back, if it's so good, why would they come back? And then so even if they come back, there's sibling tensions, all of those bad experiences. Note that then at the end of this point, we've clearly proven to you why they get a bad experience, right? Next, on improving communities. Firstly, their claim of lesser abuse doesn't make sense, because elders are probably going to stimulate against bad treatment, and also you're not actually empowering them to improve the system, and you're just going to improve tensions and worsen the treatment. That is going to destabilize the system, because 18-year-olds cannot be empowered within 1 year to overthrow the system of 18 years of their entire programming. We don't see how that makes sense. We flip that. On terms of enforcement, this also means that violence. Levi already told you why this was so bad, right? Because they can't track, it's going to look violent, it's going to look like clashes, it's going to result in worse communities. Consent doesn't matter because it washes out of the debate. We've clearly told you that already at Levi. It doesn't matter. What matters is the safety and health and mental health of these kids. We protect the children. Vote negating.
Great. I thank you very much for that speech. Now, as is traditional in schools debating, we reverse the speaking order. So I ask up negating leaders reply. Oh, I was muted. Anyway, in schools debating, we now reverse the speaking order. So thank you, Janet, for that speech. I'm now going to ask up the negating leaders reply.
Shut up. Okay, am I audible? Classic. Okay. Oh, that works. As both sides accept right from the start, this is a debate about getting the best outcomes for these young people in these communities. And as an extension of that, about bettering these communities for future generations. AF fails at any point to prove why there is this massive necessity to help these people outside of a few documented cases of abuse from Gloria Vale that are already vastly outweighed by those cases of peaceful groups that get stigmatized, as I tell you, at second, and as Janet weighs out at third. That is why they lose this point. That is why they harm those communities and they harm these young people. Firstly, 3 points of clash then for the House today. Firstly, on the alteration of these communities. Secondly, on the practical difficulty of transition. And thirdly, on the conflict of belief systems. Firstly, then on altering these communities. Look, AF asserts from the start that abuse is the prevailing trend of these communities and tells us that there are documented cases of abuse for things like Gloria Vale to defend this. Note that I tell you why media sensationalism at second makes this quite inaccurate and makes this very harmful to those groups, say like peaceful Shaolin monks or Mennonites, and that stigmatizing peaceful religious communities is a much greater harm anyway. We have said as well that these abusive leaders are the least likely to engage with this type of policy, and that they actually become more alienated when you tell them that they must, when they ultimately have something to lose because they're more likely to be subject to scrutiny, and so they're not actually going to want to send young people out there. That is why an enforcement mechanism is so important, and it takes us till second AF in a POI response to tell us that tax payments are how they are going to force these communities to do this. I didn't realize the IRS man is the big bad wolf for communities that don't have bookkeepers and don't actively trade and economically interact with the wider society. Note that force is then how you do this when they don't pay those taxes. Note that as we tell you quite clearly, that is force that harms those young people directly, that increases mistrust of a government, and that furthers that narrative of isolationism that leads to these attitudes, fostering more, that leads to abuse going unchecked because there is none of this interaction, and that leads to extremism only getting worse. Secondly, then, on the practical difficulty of transition. We give you many structural barriers at first that go quite unengaged with. This looks like a lack of mainstream education or qualification for these people trying to get jobs. It looks like a lack of public records or like IDs that employers rely on that are needed for things like wage protections as well. This looks like not having any accessible support network because you cannot contact the friends and family that you have grown up with and that only really understand your idea correctly, your value system correctly. AF gives us one solution, which they carry through down the line, which is support mechanisms by government. I give you 4 responses at second, and in the 4 minutes that followed, third AF could only prepare a follow-up, which was that there was no rebuttal. Note that there was, when I tell you that this increases, that this mistrust is already bad, there's going to be a lack of engagement, that there can't be effective interaction between a community that has this massive value system discrepancy, and that it's difficult to get any sort of track record of who these people are, nor garner them any support in the public eye. Jess also gives you a clear comparative of supportive collectivist communities, and I tell you why this transition disproportionately harms those groups like women in these more conservative religions who haven't developed those skills outside of being a traditional housewife, who now need to go become the breadwinner. It is against their values and it ultimately harms them. Thirdly, then, to run through on the conflict of belief systems, look, 18 years of conditioning of spirituality and as of manipulation, as Side AF disgustingly characterizes it as first, does not die when overwhelmed with a bunch of progressive ideas that you can't understand. Because you can't make that informed consent when the government is not able to contact these people that are isolationists, when these people don't ever get any exposure outside of maybe some negative talk and manipulation, as they call it. That is why you cannot change these people's mind. That is why you ultimately harm them. That is why we are so proud to oppose.
Awesome. Great. Thank you very much for that speech. I now invite up the final speaker of the debate, Affirmative Leaders Reply.
Kia ora, guys. Hope everyone's enjoyed the debate so far. Man, I thought it's been great fun. All right. Can everyone hear me? Get my timer out. Can you chuck my timer now?
No,
Just use yours. Okay, you're gonna have to turn it on. Cheers. This might be on there right there. All right, return to whenever I need it. Okay. Welcome to the conclusion of this round, where I, like a cult leader, tell the panel how to feel. Just a note of dedication, this speech is dedicated to Isabella Abel. We're so proud to represent her up today. It's so sad that she couldn't be here. First of all, the Waco siege is just like not a good example for them, right? This is the first thing they bring up in their second speech. They say like, look, there's going to be like these fiery confrontations and this is like their biggest harm, right? What we tell you is like, in these cases, these are people who have no contact with the outside world. They are demonized by their elders. They have no contrast to live against. And so they choose to go into these horrible, like death-defying situations rather than be taken. We think that our side gets better interactions with the government. We get better interactions with the outside world. And that is like one of the many, many reasons that we win this debate. Look, there is only one stakeholder in this debate and it is massive. It is entirely based on the thousands of young people who are going to grow up without the ability to freely choose the way in which they live. We think that even in our worst world, when Nick tells you that this transition is incredibly painful, incredibly difficult, and they're like able to provide no choices, no options in the world, we still actually have a choice between two options of how to live your life on our side of the house. There is no mechanism for choice ever presented at first, at second, at third, in any of their speeches for how they can actually get people who don't want to be in these communities out of these communities. It is assumed inherently throughout their speech that everyone is okay with tolerating what we have proven is like a level of abuse and control and relatively coercive, but that they're okay with tolerating like any kind of system that they don't get to like consent to. Secondly, though, in their worst world, given the choice between abuse at the hands of elders and poverty in the real world, we think that most, like at least some of these people are going to make the choice that frees them from oppression. And this is hugely important and debate winning for us because we are the only side that gets like people who are moving out of these lives and having pathways to safety and to health. Also note that they ignored the constructive value of my split that I presented at second. They had a full opportunity to respond to it on how people who still live on their side of the house end up under like awful impoverished circumstances, often end up being heavily exploited and worse off than they were in their original communities. We are the only side in this debate that guarantees a safe transition. Side with team affirming. Two kind of quick points of clash, plus the mechanism issue that we had earlier, right? Firstly, like we believe that crucially impacts on the youth in question are the only important thing in this debate, right? The only thing that this debate can be decided on is how we actually get a better freedom of choice for these people. First of all, like Noah told you that these people are like likely to succeed quite well because they have a natural curiosity to learn in this 1 year when they have like the rest of their lives to be like isolated, right? But secondly, he told you a really important mechanism that was like not even remotely substantially addressed by their team, which is that they'll have connection with people who come from their community at that age, people who formerly left their community during their year of like exile, and like thirdly, people who come from other communities, right? Why is this important that the opposition ignored this? Firstly, young people have a community of their peers ready on our side of the house. Whether these are historically different groups, whether these are Hasidic Jews or ultra Shiite Muslims, we think that the social views between these groups are relatively similar and that we are able to guarantee like a level of connection that they can't get. Note that all of their team's harms for our side of the house rely on us not being able to guarantee any kind of community, any kind of support, despite the fact that they didn't actually rebut any of Noah's mechanism that he brought you at first about how we do guarantee a community of your peers, of people who have similar views to you, even in our world. Okay, on impact on communities, like Noah brought you a really irrefutable mechanism about like how it gets rid of the people who these communities don't want anyway, without having to exile them and put them into unhealthy conditions. The only main harm they get here is that we get radical media spectacle, which we ask you like, how important actually is this, right? Given the under-apps model, these communities don't care about media presence because they are isolated. They only care about what their members think. And so the media, whatever like a bunch of middle-class New Zealanders think, isn't going to be super important to them. Finally, on mechanism, because this is the only way that Nick can win in this debate, we tell you that like things like the IRS, like the FBI, like the police department can investigate in this case. It's worked in Gloriavale, it's worked in various Hasidic Jewish communities. We tell you like their only response to this is that this doesn't work because they don't deal with money. We tell you that in almost every case, these communities deal with money. This mechanism can be enforced. And like in the case of Gloriavale, they can be taken to court. So we're so proud to affirm.
awesome. Thank you all speakers for a wonderful debate. I'm just going to leave it for a few seconds so the live stream can catch up to us, and then I'll end it.